His courtiers could smell him before they saw him. Once a towering figure of power and pride, King Henry Roman VIII spent his final days as a decaying shadow of the monarch he once was. Riddled with pus-filled ulcers, crippled by obesity, and tormented by paranoia, the once mighty ruler screamed through the night in agony that even his closest physicians couldn't soothe. Servants whispered in terror as they changed his foul dressings, knowing one wrong move could cost them their heads. The stench from his infected leg filled the halls, and the man who'd once executed wives without hesitation now faced a slower, crueler sentence. Abandoned by most, cursed by many, and trapped in a body that had become his prison, Henry Roman VIII's final days were not of royal grace but of unrelenting horror. This wasn't just the death of a king. This was the terrifying unraveling of a tyrant who once ruled with absolute power and died screaming. It's easy to picture a king on a throne, draped in velvet, towering over his court, radiating power, but by the end, that image was a lie. The man once known for his strength and presence had become almost unrecognizable. His body, once built for armor and jousting, had turned against him in every way. Obesity consumed him, swelling his frame to over 400 pounds. He couldn't walk unaided, couldn't ride, and could barely stand. The royal armor he once wore with pride now gathered dust, unable to fit over the monstrous bulk of what he'd become. His legs, twisted and swollen, were plagued with ulcers that refused to heal, bursting open with infection and stench. The pain was constant, but worse than the agony was the humiliation. Once surrounded by admirers, he now needed to be carried in a reinforced chair, like a grotesque idol, wheeled from one room to another, while servants winced from the smell. His own body had become his prison, rotting from the inside out, leaving behind a ruler trapped in decay. And yet, he still demanded to be seen as a god among men, even as his skin split, his sores wept, and his very presence filled rooms with dread. He wasn't just dying. He was unraveling before their eyes, and the worst part, the pain was only just beginning. By then, the palace wasn't just a place of royalty. It was a chamber of horrors. Every night, the halls echoed with sounds that no crown could silence. Screams, guttural, wrenching cries that bled through stone walls and sent chills down the backs of even the most seasoned servants. His ulcers had grown so deep and infected, the pain was beyond imagination. Physicians tried everything: blistering poultices, burning herbs, primitive draining methods. But nothing worked. The wounds festered, the stench, unbearable. It clung to the curtains, soaked into the sheets, and drove staff to hold their breath whenever they entered the room. Some even refused, knowing that to hesitate meant death, but so might obeying. It was like serving a dying god whose temple was rotting around them. They whispered about him in corners, how the screams kept them up, how the flesh was rotting off the bone. They prayed not for his health, but for the end. One servant was caught weeping, not out of sorrow, but fear, because she thought she heard her name in one of his fits of agony. This wasn't a peaceful decline. It was a violent unraveling, a nightly descent into madness and pain so severe it drowned out every trace of humanity. He was once feared for his fury, his laws, his executions, but now it was the sound of his suffering that terrified them most. Power may have made him king, but it couldn't quiet the screams. Pain has a way of twisting the mind, and in his case it didn't take much. The physical agony, the rotting flesh, the sleepless nights, it all fed something darker inside him. He stopped trusting anyone, not his doctors, not his counsel, not even those who had served him faithfully for years. Every face became a threat, every whisper a plot. Food tasters rotated constantly because he believed someone was trying to poison him. He'd interrogate the men who changed his bandages, convinced they were spies sent by enemies he couldn't name. Courtiers were dismissed without explanation, replaced by others who would soon suffer the same fate. The paranoia wasn't subtle, it was suffocating. He demanded absolute loyalty, yet doubted every show of it. People feared even looking too long in his direction, afraid he'd see treason in their eyes. And those closest to him, the ones who stayed, they weren't trusted either. They were watched, tested, questioned. He was a king surrounded by hundreds, and yet more alone than ever. There was no one left to tell him the truth, no one left who dared. He lived in a world of shadows and suspicion, where loyalty was meaningless, and fear was the only currency that mattered. He didn't just rule through terror. He ended up ruled by it. And in those last days, his greatest enemy wasn't a foreign army or a scheming noble. It was the ghost he saw in every reflection. Even as his body crumbled and his mind unraveled, he clung to the image of majesty like it could somehow hold him together. The silks were still imported, the feasts still prepared, the throne still polished, but beneath the gold, threaded robes was a swollen, stinking corpse that refused to die. He could barely move, yet insisted on being dressed in finery. Meals were laid before him in extravagant spreads, even though he could barely chew. He demanded to be wheeled from chamber to chamber in a custom-built chair, the effort of walking now impossible. And through it all, he acted as if nothing had changed. No one was allowed to speak of the ulcers, the pus, the stench. Courtiers had to pretend that the king was simply tired. No one dared mention the truth, that their ruler was rotting before their eyes. They bowed and smiled, even as they gagged behind their sleeves. The palace had become a theater, where everyone performed a lie. Because the only thing more dangerous than the disease eating away at him was the wrath that came from shattering his illusion. Pride, ego, power, they all demanded a show, and so the mask stayed on even as the man beneath it fell apart. He wasn't just pretending to be king, he was pretending to still be alive. And everyone around him had no choice but to play along, trapped in the final, grotesque act of a reign that refused to end. As the end closed in, he didn't seek peace, he sought control. Every moment became a calculation. Every breath was spent rewriting the future of the realm he'd carved with blood and fire. Advisors were summoned in the dead of night. Pages of his will were torn up and rewritten, names crossed out, others scribbled in. Old allies were discarded, former enemies suddenly favored. No one knew where they stood, and that's exactly how he wanted it. If he couldn't live forever, he would at least make sure that no one else could fully grasp the reins of power without his fingerprints on them. Even succession wasn't spared from his obsession. He altered titles, created new ones, shifted claims, all to ensure that the world after him would be one he'd still haunt. Nothing was left to chance, not out of strategy, but out of fear. Fear that death would make him irrelevant, fear that those he didn't choose would rise anyway. He spoke of legacy, but it wasn't about remembrance. It was about control, even from the grave. His final orders weren't blessings. They were warnings. His last breath wasn't one of peace. It was a final grip on a kingdom slipping from his grasp. In those final days, he didn't soften, he doubled down, because for a man like that, dying wasn't the worst fate. Being forgotten was. When death finally came, it wasn't swift. It crept in slowly, just like the rot that had already consumed so much of him. The body was so bloated, so diseased, that the royal physicians were afraid to even pronounce him dead at first. His chamber was sealed. Word of his passing was delayed for days, not out of respect but necessity. The stench had grown unbearable, and his body, already falling apart in life, began to break down even faster in death. The great king who once commanded empires and decapitated queens had to be buried in haste. No grand procession, no open casket, just a rush to hide the smell and the truth. Behind the public mourning, behind the black drapes and solemn faces, there was something else: relief. Not everyone wept. In hushed corners of the court, some even smiled. The reign of terror was over. No more midnight executions, no more paranoid outbursts, no more walking on the edge of a tyrant's moods. He didn't pass surrounded by love. He died surrounded by silence, and that silence said everything. Even in death, people feared him, because they knew what he'd built had been ruled by dread, not devotion. The legacy wasn't a golden one. It was stained with blood, and now with decay. And when it was over, no matter how many prayers were offered or statues raised, the truth still stood. The king didn't go out in glory. He went out screaming, so in the end, it wasn't a glorious death, a peaceful farewell, or the closing chapter of a beloved ruler's life. It was a warning. A man who once held absolute power, brought nations to their knees, and reshaped faith itself, spent his final days consumed by pain, by fear, and by the very legacy he tried to control. No crown could shield him. No title could save him. Stripped of all illusion, he died not as a god among men, but as a man undone by his own making, screaming, rotting, and alone. And if history remembers anything, let it be that even the greatest thrones cannot protect you from the truth that waits at the end.